Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 13th of March, and today I'm primarily going to be covering the situation around the Heorhiivka sector and the Donetsk front, including recent Russian strikes on certain targets, more so on the rear around the border between Dnipro and Donetsk Oblast. We'll also look at recent Russian attacks that have been occurring just to the south of the Heorhiivka front. I won't talk today about the situation on the border between Russia and Ukraine, specifically on the border between Kharkiv and Belgorod Oblast, respectively, and Sumy and Kursk Oblasts. And that's because I want to dedicate tomorrow's video primarily to discussing that situation. I wanted the topic justice. So in tomorrow's video, we're going to look at the raids that have been mainly led by several hundred men from the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian volunteer corps. These two units specifically have been involved. These are, these Russian dissident elements that are living in Ukraine and are mainly operating on the border between Ukraine and Russia. And every now and then they have coordinated attacks with the support of Ukraine and, of course, Ukrainian provided equipment to attack into some of the border patrol stations or into some of the nearby villages. And so that happened also last year in 2023 in March and around May. And so now that sort of operation, really right before the elections in Russia, has been restarted. So we're going to get into a lot of detail in tomorrow's video about that. But let's begin by looking specifically at what's been going on around the Robotyne section of the front line, because really starting around March 10th, there were additional pieces of footage that were released by Ukrainian sources which corroborated the claim that Russia has restarted attacks directly into the village. And so since about early February, the Russian forces had launched two pretty significant waves of assaults on the Heorhiivka sector, not just around Robotyne, but also around its flanks. And since then, the Russians have narrowed their focus. And in this most recent wave of assaults, the Russian forces have primarily focused on advancing from the northernmost outskirts of Novomykhailivka into the southwestern corner of Robotyne. And so that has been confirmed, first of all, by earlier footage that I talked about in my last video from the 65th Mechanized Brigade and the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, two units that have moved in dozens of their men as reinforcements to the wider Heorhiivka sector. But now there is even more footage that you can see on the map. And so I have that marked over here from the 3rd Spartan National Guard Brigade, where they hit and destroyed two Russian armored vehicles with FPV drones. And this is again a microcosm of what's been going on the front line around here for the past 3 or 4 days. In this video, this is a video that was posted by the Omega 3 National Guard unit. You have a lot of National Guard units defending here. They again utilize either FPV drones, in other cases ATGMs, and they were stationed around like the perimeter of southern Robotyne, around section like here, and they targeted whether it was a Russian BTR 82 that was targeted or a Desert Cross ATV, which we've seen the Russians start to use more. Both of them were destroyed in the most recent pieces of footage released. But in any case, what that footage confirmed to us is that the Russian forces were able to pass through this particular road that really goes through the fortification system that the Ukrainians had taken back from the Russian forces, because the Russian forces secured this trench system in their earlier attacks towards Robotyne. You could say like 2-3 weeks ago, they had temporary control over it and then were pushed out by the Ukrainians, you could say 2 weeks ago. And there were some recent videos of the Russian forces shelling the Ukrainians in the easternmost sections of this trench system. But in the western section, we haven't really seen much footage. It seems like either that area is a complete gray zone or the Russian infantry have actually solidified control over those trenches, because now the Russian vehicles do have the opportunity to cross through this area without having to fear any sort of pushback from these particular regions from Ukrainian soldiers. And so the Russian forces were able to directly reach the southern outskirts of Robotyne around this blue line. And that is where we saw the most heavy confrontations. Russian sources are claiming that they were able to gain a foothold in the southwestern portion of the village. And to a certain extent, this was confirmed by footage released by the 70th Motor Rifle Regiment, one of Russia's main units conducting these attacks. So today, actually, the 70th Regiment released a 10-minute video where they show the course of a Russian attack with a pretty large armored column that was advancing likely around this road or nearby fields. And they pass through the fortification system and they begin engaging with Ukrainian targets in some of the nearby fields and some of these tree lines, which they were able to take over. And they dismounted infantry squads that then made their way and started entering into the houses within the village. And so it does appear that at this moment in time, there are battles going on in some of the southernmost houses. And so far, we don't have any official geolocation of the video. And so I'm just saying from a broad sense, based on where I saw the video, how it's located, that it's likely around this section over here where I'm marking with these X's. And we're going to have to wait and see tomorrow to get additional information about the status of this part of the front. But the attack that I just mentioned in that video was pretty wide scale. You could see in the video that there was artillery support targeting the Ukrainian defenders in the tree lines. And there is a lot of drone coverage for the Russians with these Russian drones that are in real time communicating with the Russian vehicles, Russian infantry squads that are on the ground as they advance. And so that's also playing a part in the results. Just to the southwest of Vuhledar, recently the Russian forces have upticked their offensive activities using, you can't say they're armored columns, but you could say that they've been utilizing several armored vehicles at a time to try to gradually push the front line towards the preferred directions, which in this case would be to create a buffer zone around the village of Shevchenko, with the Russian forces wanting to establish a forward operating base for infantry in some of these tree lines that would allow them to then advance further north and reach this highway, which connects Pervomaiske to some of the other villages in the region, and also to the open fields that then reach their way from Pervomaiske to Vuhledar, which really acts as a way of connecting the Ukrainian defensive nodes in the Velika and Novosilka sector further to the west, and the ones around Vuhledar that have been holding strong throughout these past many months. But in any case, the Russian forces, they were able to advance several hundred meters to the west in this area over here, taking over about a kilometer of new territory westwards, overrunning some tree lines. But you could say that in terms of the Russian assaults, a lot of them have been repelled recently by the 58th Motorized Brigade, which is a unit that was moved, I believe, like, say in October, September of last year to the Velika and Novosilka sector. But since the fighting has died down in that region, it was moved to the area in between Velika Novosilka and Vuhledar in order to prevent the Russian forces, which include the 35th or actually 36th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, from gradually increasing their control. And as I said before, overarching goal of this is to create the necessary conditions to flank Vuhledar, fire onto Vuhledar from more advantageous positions, because a lot of Russia's plans on the wider southern Donetsk front are centered around eventually flanking Vuhledar from various directions and actually taking it over. And so although we're not seeing heavy fighting from the sector now, I would urge everybody to keep their eyes on it as the Russian attacks continue. Around Novomykhailivka, we see that recently, over the past 2 days, the Russian forces have advanced several hundred meters to the west, I could say about 800 meters westwards, and were able to secure the entirety of this local road and its nearby tree line that are located on the easternmost outskirts of Novomykhailivka. This is a part of the process that is being carried out by the 155th Marine Brigade of clearing out the remaining Ukrainian resistance with their infantry that are still holding on to some of these easternmost houses, and including this warehouse and agricultural facilities. There was also a vector of attack launched by the Russians about a week ago to try to flank Novomykhailivka from the westernmost section of that village. And so far, there isn't any confirmation of the Russian forces being able to dismount and actually get a foothold within these houses. And that was a week ago. So this seemed like the Ukrainian defenders from the 79th Air Assault Brigade were able to repel the Russian columns that were attacking through the fields in this direction over here, marked in red. Meanwhile, around Pobjeda, the Ukrainians are continuing to launch localized counterattacks. So far, they've been unsuccessful in re-entering Pobjeda or gaining back any land. A lot of the Ukrainian attacks have been really bolstered by the arrival of reinforcements like the 33rd Mechanized Brigade and so their leopards have been engaged in the fighting over here, and some have been damaged in the course of the fights against the Russian forces. But nonetheless, the opposite is actually true. Now the Russians have actually started to advance, creating additional buffer zones around the village. And as we talked about in earlier videos, Pobjeda is extremely important as it gives the Russians a forward base, and the fields around it are also very good because they overlook the Ukrainian lines that are starting in Novomykhailivka and then branch out into Konstantinivka and various other villages that are connected through this particular road that I'm marking in red over here. So it is a very good opportunity to establish a firing position, a forward attacking position from a height from the northern flank. And now the Russians are securing it by advancing several hundred meters to the north of Pobjeda. You could say about 1 kilometer northwards. This was verified by geolocation showing Russian tanks operating in these open fields, trying to conduct mine sweeping operations to ensure that vehicles can freely roam through this area. And that's also because the Russian forces want to clear out the Ukrainian resistance that is still present in between Heorhiivka and Pobjeda, because there are still some Ukrainian elements from the 79th, and you could say also the 31st Mechanized Brigade operating in some of these open fields around here in pretty small numbers. Within Heorhiivka, actually, the Russian forces did manage to advance slightly. The Russian forces, they were able to advance, if you measure it, you could say several hundred meters again. Common theme in this video. They were able to reach this demarcation line, which is basically based upon the pond, the easternmost pond in the village. And so you could say that this was actually verified by attacks that were launched by the Ukrainians using FPV drones. There were 2 FPV drone strikes that were released in the footage. They targeted 2 BMPs, and there was also Russian infantry accompanying those vehicles. And so that's been the Russian strategy, to just gradually advance through this section, clearing it out, using armored vehicles with the supports of infantry that are sent into certain dugouts or into houses or the rubble of those houses, and just clearing it out one by one, because this front is very, very narrow. You can't have a large concentration of vehicles or troops, and so the process of clearing everything out just becomes more arduous. At the same time, though, the Russian forces are trying to speed up the process by getting control of the plantation areas just to the north of Heorhiivka, so they get a local hill that overlooks the Ukrainian positions in the valley of Heorhiivka. And you can see the Russian forces were able to advance several hundred meters westwards in this plantation area. Now moving on to the situation just to the south of the Avdiivka front, we're going to look at what's going on around Pervomaiske and Nevelske. If you recall, the Ukrainians, they launched their counterattack at the end of February towards the Russian positions to the west of Avdiivka. And now we've seen recently those Ukrainian assaults dying down, both in terms of the ferocity of those assaults, but also in terms of the gains made by the Ukrainians. And a big consequence of this attack is the Ukrainians have been forced to move in additional reserves and also rotate some units from some certain parts of the front line to assist in the offensive activity. And so that includes likely moving in certain elements of the 53rd Mechanized Brigade and several other units that were involved in defending against the Russian attacks in Pervomaiske, Nevelske, and Nevelske, respectively, which may include the 59th Motorized Brigade. I can't say with certainty, but it is certainly possible given their proximity to the Avdiivka front. And so the Russian forces took advantage of the Ukrainians rotating their forces from this section of the line in order to conduct their own attacks. And so what the Ukrainians or the Russians did is they didn't just launch head-on assaults through Pervomaiske, because it is extremely difficult. Even though the village is very small, as you can see, it is a very similar shape as of Marinka or Heorhiivka, in the sense that it's a very narrow village that has to be cleared out head-on. If you are to do that, then it is a very arduous process to just go one by one and go through each house. And so the Russians have decided to bypass this by attacking through the village of Vodiane. In Vodiane, the Russian forces, throughout the entire Avdiivka offensive starting in October of last year, they also launched secondary attacks further westwards from their positions in the center of Vodiane. And over time, they were able to send vehicles, many were damaged or destroyed, but throughout that process, they were able to gain control of more and more houses within that village. And by doing so, we got control of the perimeter of this local pond marked over here. And now using those forward positions, the Russian forces, starting around March 8th, were able to infiltrate into the northernmost sections of Pervomaiske. And so as you can see, there's a Russian attack vector going southwards, entering into some of the clinics, some of the stores within Pervomaiske, not as much of the residential area. And from there, at the same time, the Russians launched an assault directly through Pervomaiske, which was able to yield the Russians with about, let's measure it actually, a gain of around 900, 800 meters just to the northwest. And this Russian advance was verified by video released by the 59th Motorized Brigade, showing 2 BMPs being hit. Again, we're seeing a lot of BMPs and vehicles hit in these FPV videos in these narrow villages, but it does confirm the Russian advance along the main road, which is again due to the fact that the Ukrainians first of all moved some reinforcements to Avdiivka, and then the Russian forces opened up a flanking maneuver from the north, and so the remaining Ukrainian units were stretched so thin and they were forced to withdraw from some of their forwardmost positions in the southern sections of Pervomaiske. And so now the Ukrainian garrison in Pervomaiske has been left in this small envelopment. Of course, there is still a way out, but you can see how the Russians are applying pressure, trying to squeeze out the Ukrainians and trying to fire upon them in the process. And by doing so, the Russian forces are trying to solidify control over the areas directly to the east of Nevelske, as that is a key local target for the Russian forces, as it acts as a local node for the Ukrainian defense. Previously, before it was that close to the front line, it was more so of a local command node and logistical hub, but now that it is so close, the Ukrainians may have moved some of their assets a bit further to the west. But at the same time, the Russian forces have expanded their assaults by also attacking Nevelske. Now, here's the thing about Nevelske. The Russian assaults over here, they started around the 11th or 12th of March, depending on the reports. And then on the 12th of March, the Russian MOD did announce the capture of the village. And there so far is not any confirmation of this capture from Ukrainian sources that I've looked at. I haven't seen any footage of Russian forces walking through Nevelske as of March 13th, although that could change. What we do have is a video which shows the Russian infantry taking over the tree lines directly to the east of Nevelske, which does mean there was Russian offensive activity here. The Russian forces, and that includes tank elements. I have some of those units actually marked on the map over here. Also, some DPR units like the 110th Motorized Rifle Brigade have played a big role in the attacks around Nevelske. And so their infantry, they were able to advance through the line of contact and get control over 800 meters to the north, getting control of an additional tree line and flanking Nevelske at the very least. And at this point, given how close the Ukrainian garrison would be to the line of contact and to such a large Russian assault, it is possible, it is very possible that the Ukrainians have already withdrawn or been pushed out of Nevelske. I'm just waiting for the official confirmation. But at the same time, the Russian forces are also targeting the Ukrainians several kilometers to the west, because the Ukrainians used to use Nevelske as a forward artillery hub to fire onto Russian targets, industrial targets, military targets in Donetsk, and in some of the villages that are even closer, like Pisky, Novomykhailivka. And so that was a large Ukrainian artillery battery area. Of course, now it can't be used as such because the Russian forces have put so much pressure on it. But even recently, the past several months, you have had Ukrainian mortar crews firing from this village. And so now the Ukrainians, or the Russians, have eliminated a large node that was used to attack their forces, including their logistics, as they were organizing in the massive city of Donetsk. And so any sort of Ukrainian organization of the artillery has been pushed back further westwards into this chain of villages over here. And so that was actually verified based on recent Russian footage showing their counter battery activity, targeting three Ukrainian artillery pieces that are around Heorhiivka, primarily about 7 kilometers to the northwest of the current front line, if I were to measure it out. So something like this. And so there is still some very active Russian counter battery fire against the Ukrainians in this section, as they continue their advances. So as you can see on the map over here, I'll mark Nevelske in blue and also Pervomaiske in blue. I believe that the Russians, by trying to conduct these assaults and clear out these villages, that are preparing the stage for a flanking maneuver to the north of Krasnohorivka. Recently, we've seen the Russian forces uptick pressure on the southern flank of Krasnohorivka, which does make sense because it is less well defended than the eastern flank of Krasnohorivka, which has been extremely fortified over the course of 10 years now, as it's on the line of contact directly with the DPR. But now the Russians are trying to take advantage of the Ukrainians really being spread out thin in several areas on the Donetsk front and opening this new attack vector. And as you can see, the fields to the west of Nevelske, they are marked on relatively higher elevation. Of course, it's not that significant. I'll mark it in orange for you guys. It is a relatively hilly area when you compare it to the valley on which Krasnohorivka is located on. And so that explains some of the rationale. Also, the Ukrainians don't have that many fortifications built up to defend against such a northern flanking scenario. And by clearing out Krasnohorivka, the Ukrainians would clear out one of the last remaining forward defensive nodes built up 10 years ago that is overlooking Donetsk, or not overlooking, but at least bordering Donetsk and being used to fire towards it. And lastly, we're going to look at Russian strikes on two Russian helicopters that were destroyed and an additional one that was damaged. This footage was released today on the 13th, and on the 12th, the Russians did announce the destruction of two such helicopters. And I'm not sure, based on the video that was released, whether it's an Mi-8 or an Mi-17 transport helicopter, because they do look pretty similar. And if it was an Mi-17 helicopter, then it was one of the ones provided by the United States, likely in 2022 or 23. Anyway, here's the geolocation for that. Two Ukrainian Mi-8 or 17s destroyed near Novomykhailivka. Novomykhailivka is a town that is located within Dnipro Oblast. It is bordering Donetsk Oblast. And so a lot of the resources, a lot of the helicopters that will be landing in this direction, they're most likely tied to either the Velika Novosylka front or further eastwards towards what's going on the wider Donetsk city axis. So the video itself, released by the Russians, it was likely recorded by a Supercam S350 drone. And what it shows is there were three helicopters stationed, and at that point they were targeted by a Russian strike using Tornado S missiles with cluster munition warheads. And so all three of the helicopters in that strike were damaged by the shrapnel from those cluster rounds. But based on the aftermath footage released by the Russians, one of them, specifically, one of those helicopters, was able to make its way out and escape. So here's the actual footage, and for once it actually is in good resolution, as you can see. And the idea is, also you can see the transport vehicles over here. Now here's the cluster rounds being fired towards those helicopters, and you can see that one is no longer in the frame, probably because it was evacuated. And then you have two left that were abandoned by the Ukrainians, and at that point they were targeted by guided Russian missiles. I'm not sure which type, but they destroyed both of those helicopters. And honestly, calling them abandoned would be a misnomer, because on the same day, the Ukrainians announced the death of two of their pilots from the 12th Army Aviation Brigade that were killed around Donetsk Oblast, pretty close to this strike. And so they were likely trying to get those other helicopters off the ground and evacuate them before the Russians targeted them with guided missiles and killed those pilots. Additionally, Russian sources published video of their drones monitoring a transport truck as it made its way from generally the fields to the northeast of Novomykhailivka, and then made its way, about 900 meters southwest to a Ukrainian warehouse where they probably have a large storage of vehicles or equipment within those warehouses. And at that point, once they made its way into the facility, they launched using Su-34s at least one fab bomb that exploded in this specific coordinates. Now, we still don't have a official confirmed reason for why you had a concentration of three helicopters at an area that it's not extremely close to the front line, but if you take a measuring stick and just gauge distance from the front line, you could say 55 kilometers. And to be fair, recently we've seen a lot of these Russian videos come out where they are striking at similar distances, basically on the border between Donetsk and Dnipro Oblast. And so it really begs the question, why would there be such a large concentration of such important aerial assets for the Ukrainians at such a direction? And so it could be because there was an important unloading or offloading of certain materials that is connected to this warehouse area and was being coordinated through the logistical trucks that we saw in the video. And maybe if the timeline is different and the first strike was actually on the warehouse and then the helicopters were moved in as some sort of medical evacuation, I'm really not sure. But I am just laying out all the potential possibilities. In any case, it is exacerbating an already existing issue with the quality and quantity of Ukraine's airframes at their disposal. And of course, we've also seen the Russians lose a lot of their, for instance, Ka-52 attack helicopters in some of these Ukrainian strikes. I covered, for instance, the ATACMS strikes that occurred on Russian airfields that targeted a lot of such helicopters. But again, the difference is the Russian forces could replace those losses by domestically producing them, and Ukrainians don't have the same production capability as they are dependent on such shipments of helicopters a lot of the time from Eastern European countries, Croatia. They've been a big help in that regard, and earlier on, the United States provided some. And additionally, this strike backs up the trend we've been noticing of improved Russian ISR as we've seen the Russians release a slew of footage of similar strikes, targeting similar assets like the air defense convoy talked about in the last video. And some of these may be from earlier on in the war, but regardless, there has definitely been a Russian improvement in their utilization of drones, reconnaissance drones that go deep into Ukrainian territory, spot certain Ukrainian targets, key assets, and then are able to readily communicate with the Russian artillery or the Russian Air Force in order to organize such attacks. That communication process definitely has been streamlined recently. Besides improvements to drone technology, some of the Russian intelligence improvement could be due to the launching of new military satellites into orbit. But really, besides that, a lot of it has to do with Ukraine's air defense. A lot of the existing Ukrainian air defense systems that were previously stationed, 50, 60 kilometers away from the front line haven't moved closer in recent months due to Russia's ramping up of their Fab 500, Fab 1500 strikes on the front line. Those strikes, they launch them at a certain angle that allows the Su-34s not to be directly flying above the front line, and so they could be really deep into Donetsk Oblast. We can measure it like 50, 60 kilometers away from the front line, depending on the type of strike, in order to conduct such large blast fields of strikes on key parts of the battlefield. And so the Ukrainians have opted to now, in order to reduce Russia's localized air superiority in some of these battles, to move some of these air defense systems even closer to the front line than even the border between Donetsk and Dnipro Oblast. And there are some consequences to this. One of them being that the Russian forces could then send in Lancet drones and target the air defense systems or their supporting radars directly, which causes more losses to the Ukrainian air defense. But secondly, it reduces the coverage that the Ukrainians have really across, not the rear, but in some of the areas that are farther away from the front line. For instance, like the ones that we're seeing now in these most recent rounds of footage where we haven't really seen such a response from the Ukrainian air defense. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.